Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are we getting on? So, ever since it was first announced, Todd Howard and people over at Bethesda, and a few others as well, have been comparing Starfield to Skyrim and saying it would be a bit like Skyrim in space. But there is obviously a fairly big question there as to exactly how it will be similar, how it will be different. And now that we've had a little bit more information coming out over the last few months, I think we can take a decent look at this and actually have a crack at answering that. Obviously, there's going to be a certain amount of speculation in there, because we haven't seen gameplay or anything like that yet. But it'll be interesting to have a look at what we can expect, what will be similar to Skyrim, what might not be as well, and hopefully answer the question of just how alike the two games will be. Okay, so before we dive right into the details, obviously we know it's coming out at the end of the year. Obviously we haven't seen any gameplay of the game yet, we've just seen a few little bits of concept art and seen Bethesda discussing sort of the general world and bits and pieces of information about it. So we'll have to wait till the summer before we see anything hard and fast, but despite that, I think we can draw a few reasonable conclusions and do a little bit of speculation as well, so there's going to be some of that in here as well today. So, just how much like Skyrim will Starfield be? Well, it's very, very easy to say it's going to be a sci-fi game, not a fantasy one, and therefore not that much like it at all. It's also quite easy to say it's going to be a Bethesda game, so things are going to be familiar, but I think we can actually give a bit more information than that and do a slightly better job of answering the question. So let's have a look at that. So Todd Howard, and as I say, others as well, have compared the two games, said Starfield will be like Skyrim in space. To me, I would interpret that as being sort of like Skyrim meets Mass Effect. I would say don't read too much into that, because it's probably going to put a few images in your head, and there's a good bet that those images will be some close, some way wide of the mark. So let's not read too much into that. We'll have to wait and see. For example, Mass Effect has its heavy emphasis on meeting different alien species and races, like the Asari and so on and so forth. But we have absolutely no idea whether or not sentient alien species are going to be a thing in Starfield at the minute. We haven't heard anything to suggest they will. So maybe not. We'll have to wait and see. One of the big areas that has been talked about a lot and will likely be influencing Starfield as well from Skyrim is the success Skyrim's had over the last 10 years. As you know, it's now 10 years old, and the game is still being played a huge amount. It's one of Bethesda's most successful ever, and it's definitely one of the most successful games of the last 10 years as well. There are others out there, of course, that have done even better, but it's still been a massive smash hit, and people are still playing it a lot. And Bethesda have said that one of the things they want to do is draw upon that to make subsequent games, so Starfield, the next Elder Scrolls game, and the eventual next Fallout game when that arrives, more of a long-term playable experience for the player base. Which makes a lot of sense. Obviously, it keeps people interested, and it buys them time to work on the next title as well, because we know Bethesda release a game roughly every 3 to 4 years, or Bethesda Game Studios specifically. So in all likelihood, they'll want to capitalise on the success Skyrim had in terms of its longevity and try and bring something similar to Starfield, and as I say, subsequent games as well, that will mean that there's plenty to find, plenty to keep doing, plenty of ways to play going forward, so that the game stays interesting to people and will have that long kind of lifespan. And yeah, I think we can conclude that they're going to have a good crack at this. So, talking about the style of games Bethesda generally make, we know from things they have said over the years that Bethesda try and make the games that they, as a group of people, are interested in playing, and that means there are certain hallmarks of a Bethesda game that Starfield will almost certainly have, and that we can expect to see and we can draw further conclusions about from the things that they have told us already. So, top of the list is obviously the overarching stuff like the tone of the game, the sort of atmosphere and the feel of the world. Bethesda are very much into those topics and really try and build tone, feeling, atmosphere to kind of transport you into this world. It's something they talk about a lot, and I'm sure many from playing off Skyrim can remember how that works, and true of Fallout as well. So I expect we'll see something similar in Starfield as well, certainly a very atmospheric, immersive, tone-heavy world, which is generally the way Bethesda go. We can also expect to see the Bethesda sense of humour, I suspect, coming in. We're not seeing anything to hint at that yet as to what form that might take, but Bethesda do have a fairly pronounced sense of humour, so I would be very, very surprised if we don't see that emerging in the game as we play through it in November. So one of the big things that Bethesda have been talking about in recent months is the way in which they approach the development process. And one of the first things they do, particularly leading into the topic of tone that we talked about before, is the music aspect. So this time around, the composer is different to Starfield. They are going with Xion, who has done the last couple of Fallout games as well, and he's done a really great job on those. And he's also known for Dragon Age and, frankly, a crazy long list of other games as well. So if you happen to look the fella up, you'll be there a while. But he's a brilliant composer, and he's done some amazing work. And that tone aspect comes a lot from the music, or so Bethesda have been telling us. It's something that they do really early on in the development, is start getting the music into place for the game, so that you can get that feel, the atmosphere, and it informs a lot of the rest of the development they do. It's something they did for Skyrim, which is why you've got the iconic music that then leads into the feeling of the world, and it's something they're going to do again for Starfield. So tonally, we can expect to see the fingerprints. Obviously, very different game. The tone will be different, but the way it's built will probably be quite familiar. If you're interested in actually hearing a bit more of that music, I've not put it in this video because copyright and all that stuff, but I have linked a lot of stuff down below and most of the resources that I'm going to reference here, so you can have a rummage through them yourself if you want to. So have a look in the description for that, including the Skyrim 10th anniversary concert, which ended with a 10-minute section of Starfield music. So there's a link down there that'll take you straight to that, or you can look it up on Spotify as well if you want to check it out on there. So you can get a little bit of the vibe of Starfield ahead of time if you would like to. So yeah, having listened to that score, I should say, it's very, very cool. It's very, very atmospheric. Bethesda generally do big, atmospheric, orchestral, almost movie-like scores. It's the sort of road they usually go down. They did it for Skyrim, they've done it for both the recent Fallout games, and they're doing it again for Starfield as well, and it's certainly a feeling you're going to get from checking out that score should you want to. So definitely going to be familiar in its sort of epic orchestral vibe, I think, as well. So in that regards, something that a lot of people did like from Skyrim, its music, that underlying feeling, even though they've changed composers, and that atmosphere and the really big orchestral score will be a familiar element in Starfield as well. So, that leads on quite nicely into the worlds aspect, the worlds that they are building, and specifically we're talking about multiple ones because we are going into space and landing on multiple planets. So we know Bethesda make open world games. It's what they do, it's not likely to change for this one. We know it's going to be big open worlds that you can explore, sort of. We've been told so far that the area of the game is roughly 50 light years or so out from our real-world solar system, so this sort of area. It'll be fictionalized, but that's the sort of scale of the game. What Bethesda usually do, obviously, is once you get through the initial beginning of the game, you can then just go wherever you like, whenever you like. They've done that for Fallout, they've done it for Skyrim and the rest of Elder Scrolls. It'll almost certainly be the same here. So you get through that first section of the game, and then the world will open up. In this case, that's probably going to mean that you can go to various planets and then explore smaller open worlds on the planets. We've had hints of these open worlds already in terms of the concept art and reference to some of the locations and areas outside those locations. So we do know there's going to be explorable areas. Bethesda basically said exploration is the key thing behind this game. It's going to inform the main faction that the player's part of, and obviously the world design, that sort of thing. It's big in Skyrim, it's big in Fallout, it's very much the Bethesda thing. Create big spaces for the player to go out and explore and find stuff, and get up to all manner of stuff, and adventures and hijinks and the like. It's the sort of game Bethesda like to make, and it's what they're likely to do here as well. It's certainly been implied already. My personal feeling on this is that what we're going to get is obviously multiple smaller open worlds, basically because we'll be landing on multiple planets and then each one will have its own explorable space, as well as having the larger galaxy, which will probably be mostly focused on travelling between planets. We might have space combat, things like that, but we've heard nothing whatsoever about it so far, so we just don't know yet. I mean, I guess we'll find out in coming months or possibly over the summer, but yeah, in terms of the open world aspect, it's likely to be probably slightly smaller than, say, Skyrim or Fallout on individual planets, and we'll have multiple different styles of them. We've seen from the concept art, there's desert worlds that are in the concept art, there's jungle worlds, there's city worlds. There's all sorts of stuff like that that we'll probably get to explore that will be very, very interesting, as opposed to having just smaller regions within a single larger open world map. We'll have dominant types of world, I suspect, but on a slightly smaller scale than, say, Skyrim's full map is. I mean, the modern technology might mean that they're bigger than we expect. Hopefully, that'd be great. but I suspect that's probably the way they're going to go. So the open world aspect, familiar, it'll look like Skyrim. Well, it won't look that much like Skyrim, but it'll be similar in its style to the Skyrim and to Fallout, wherein you can get out and explore, but there'll be multiple of them and they might be a bit smaller. So, having a look at some of these worlds that we do know about already, we've got New Atlantis, which is the capital of the United Colonies. This is one of the more powerful groups. It looks city-centric. We've seen a shot from the city's starport, and that seems to be inferring one world that will be mostly city-based. Don't know if we'll be able to get outside of that city and explore the larger world. The city looks like it might be at the top of a mountain, so as to how much exploration outside the city there will be on that world, who knows? Maybe it'll be more of an urban type of world to explore. We've also seen Aquila City, which is the capital of the Freestar Collective. It looks like it'll probably be a smaller sort of settlement. It's the one that makes me think of Tatooine in Star Wars. It's very, very cool. I like the look of it. But this is one of the places we do know we can get outside of for sure, because they've talked about the city having walls and the dangerous predatory wildlife outside. In particular, one example would be a creature that was described as being a cross between a wolf and a velociraptor. So probably not something to hug. But yes. If we're going to run into that, it'll be outside the city, which is cool. So definitely confirmation of getting outside the capital city of Aquila City there. And being as it's called Aquila City, seems like the planet itself will probably be called Aquila as a whole as well. But that will be interesting. We also know that there are two other worlds in the Freestar Collective as well, the secondary faction there that are, as I say, a loose affiliation of planets. So that definitely confirms a couple of other worlds that we'll be able to land on and explore and interact with people in as well, which is cool. We've also heard about a planet called Xion, which is looking like being a large city-sized fishing platform that got converted into a pleasure city, which basically means drugs, casinos, brothels, all that sort of stuff. It's going to be an off-the-path sort of red light district of the settled systems, I believe they're called. And that sort of vibe is what will be going on there. So we've got multiple different worlds with different vibes, different atmospheres. Much like different regions in Skyrim and different cities in Skyrim have different atmospheres and the like, this same sort of thing will be cropping up in Starfield, but it'll be on different planets. Probably. Seems likely. So when we have a look around the world, what sort of things we see in it that we're likely to see in Starfield that will come over from things like Skyrim are things like set dressing and little interactable objects, like picking up the coffee cups was an example Todd Howard gave in one of the promotional videos for Starfield. And there'll be things like lore books. There might not be books. They might be sort of iPads, that sort of thing, Star Trek style maybe, with bits of lore and stuff in them. That's sort of almost Mass Effect-ish as well. On the other hand, in the trailer we do see actual paper books in the player's starship, so it does seem possible that we'll find books and the like that we can have a leaf through as well. We look at Skyrim, obviously there are hundreds of books in that game with tons and tons of lore and stuff in, and we're very likely to see a similar approach in Starfield to sort of flesh out the world, bring it to life, and give us an idea about the background and the environment and the life and understanding that the characters are living their lives against that kind of a backdrop. So I suspect we'll see a lot of that, which will be recognisable as it is in Skyrim, but obviously unique to Starfield. So when we look at the technology level in Starfield, we're also going to see some similarities to their previous games, like Skyrim, and also obviously some differences because we're talking about a sci-fi game. With Starfield, they've talked about the technology level being grounded in reality, even though it's sci-fi. So if we take a look at the player concept art that we've seen so far, you can see the player in a spacesuit, which is a bit lighter than, say, the stuff we'd see astronauts today wearing, but you can see in terms of the fabrics and the general design that it has come from the sort of spacesuits NASA astronauts wear today. And we also know that there's a friendship between Todd Howard, the game director for Starfield, and Elon Musk of SpaceX, and that Todd Howard at least has been out to SpaceX and had a look around. It seems likely that other members of the design team and the development team will probably have been out there as well to inform the creation of the world, so it'll give us some inkling as to what the technology ought to look like. It's going to look somewhat familiar. We can see from the concept art that a lot of it is reminiscent of things like the International Space Station and stuff like that, but also being taken forward a couple of hundred years. At least that's the idea. Obviously that's quite different to Skyrim with its technology level, but the way it's sort of structured and organised is somewhat similar in a theoretical sense, I think. Obviously with Skyrim, you're looking at a historical fantasy RPG, but the sort of similarity comes in that you've got a recognisable level of base technology. So, you've got swords, you've got bows, you've got the building materials they use, and all the basic low-level stuff in the game, in the various human races in the game as well, all are somewhat familiar. And then you've got the layer of the fantastic stuff on the top of it. Obviously, with things like the elves, you get Dwemer locations, you get magic and things like that. Starfield is going to probably be structured in a similar sort of way, but without fantasy, it'll have more advanced technologies instead. And we know we're going to see hostile alien wildlife species. As to whether or not we'll see sentient aliens, we're going to have to wait and see and find out, I guess. But in terms of its basic assembly, the sort of technology levels, they're going to be comparable, even though they're completely different, I think. So, familiar, but different again. So one of the defining features of Skyrim, and to a lesser degree Fallout as well, that is also going to be present in Starfield, and quite recognisable, I think, is the faction system. Todd Howard suggested in interviews that this particular setup is going to be very recognisable to Skyrim players. Obviously, in Skyrim, we've got sort of multiple factions that kind of fall into three broad categories. You've got the Stormcloaks, the Imperials, and the Thalmor, who are the higher tier political factions, for want of a better way of explaining it. Then below that, you've got groups like the Dark Brotherhood, the Thieves Guild, the College of Winterhold, and so on, who are smaller scale, more focused groups, who are also factions, but as I say, they're more focused on one area. And then, of course, you've got the non-joinable factions like the Forsworn as well. Now, we know a little bit, as I've just touched on before, about factions in Starfield. Some of them, again, are going to be the high-level ones, the big political entities. Some of them are going to be smaller and more focused. Probably we only really know about one, maybe two of those so far. And there are non-joinable ones as well that are going to be focused more around enemies and other groups that will also crop up too. So looking at what those are, at the top end, we've got Constellation, which looks like it'll be one of the medium-sized, smaller factions, but it's the one the player joins, and they are the last group of space explorers. That's about all we know about them now. Apparently there's a certain mystique around them. They might also be a bit more fringe from the tone I've picked up from the various things Bethesda have said about them, which isn't much, to be fair, but I've got a hunch they're going to be a bit more on the edge. They'll be sort of a group that people look up to, maybe, and but they're also kind of kept at arm's length as well, maybe. That's my feeling and vibe on it. But we will have to see when the game actually launches, or when we get told a bit more about them. In terms of the two major political factions, as with Skyrim, we have this going on in Starfield as well. We also have hostilities between them, much like Skyrim as well. We have the United Colonies, who are based in the capital city of New Atlantis. And these guys are the most powerful of the political and military factions. They're going to be a very dominating force. They're a lot like everything that there is about cities in the real world today, sort of taken up to space. And an actual evolution of that is the description, and very much a melting pot of peoples as well, apparently. On the other side to them, we have the Free Star Collective, which is a loose affiliation of star systems that don't want to be part of the United Colonies, want to do their own thing. They're all about personal freedom and individuality and that sort of stuff. Their capital is Aquila City, which is this desert Tatooine-like world. And we know the two factions there had a war some years before. I believe it was about 20, 30 years before. The fallout and the aftermath of that is still around and will be influencing what goes on in the game and the relationships we have with the various factions. So, again, that's broadly familiar to the whole Stormcloaks versus Imperials in Skyrim, but again, it's in space and it's different. Looking at the smaller factions, obviously we've kind of touched on Constellation, the player's faction already. We've got Xenofresh Corporation, who are the controlling interest of Neon, this pleasure city, gambling, drug city, etc., etc. They built this fishing platform and found a native species of fish on the planet that Neon is on that basically are hallucinogenic fish, and decided to make a drug out of it, which is banned everywhere else, but in their city you can go crazy on it. So, this is, I suspect, a non-joinable faction. I don't know, but I've got a hunch on that one. But they are obviously going to be involved. They're likely to be a significant player in the player's experiences of Starfield as well. So, another small faction there. It'll be interesting to see what's going on with them. Maybe there'll be conflicts between them and other groups. It'll be interesting to explore that in more detail. But we do know they're going to crop up, and there are some hints in the concept art that they might have a significant impact on the player's journey as well. Neon looks like it might be a big stopping point on the player's exploration of the world of Starfield. So below that, obviously, we have the non-joinable factions, sort of enemy factions, which are probably going to be comparable in their position to the Forsworn in Skyrim. And the ones that we've had mentioned so far are groups of mercenaries, groups of pirates, both of whom are likely to view the player as a target, particularly the pirates, because one person flying around in their starship on their own is probably going to look like easy prey. I guess we'll be debasing them of that particular notion. And there's also a mention of a group of religious fanatics as well, who, as to whether or not they'll be joinable, who knows? You've got Children of Atom in Fallout, sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. I wonder if there'll be some vague familiarity there. Those are called House Veru, apparently, and we know almost nothing about them other than that they're a group of religious fanatics. So, definitely another smaller faction there that will be interesting to explore and learn more about, much like we get in Bethesda's other games. Coming towards the latter sections now, gameplay. Obviously, this is really hard to comment too much on because we haven't seen any yet, and we'll have to wait until the summer to get a sure image of this. But speculatively and drawing some conclusions from what they've done in the past, we know it's a single-player game. We know it's going to be focused on the player as the hero, much like Bethesda's other games are, be that Fallout or Skyrim. It'll likely be first or third-person optional, much like their other games are. They tend to lean towards first person as their preference, Bethesda, basically because it gets you right in there and immersed and right up as part of the world, rather than peering over your own shoulder. But if you do like third person, they usually accommodate that, so it seems probable that they will do so again here. I suspect, judging by the tone of what they've said about Constellation, and the fact that the player is the newest member of Constellation, also it has been implied, that we're going to start out rather obscure, much like you do in, say, well, all of Bethesda's previous games, really, but particularly in Skyrim. Nobody really knows who you are, nobody really cares who you are when you first start the game, and it is your exploits that start to spread your reputation around country of Skyrim, in Fallout, the various parts of the Wasteland, and the settled systems in Starfield, most likely. Again, speculative, but it seems like the likely scenario. That's the way Bethesda usually do things. So, combat and the like, we have seen nothing of so far, so we're going to have to speculate here again as well. We've seen an assault rifle put down in the trailer, which looks very, very cool. My personal guess, and it is a pure guess here, is that this game is going to lean more towards long-range shooting-type combat. And my hunch for this is based on the fact if you look at Skyrim, you've got melee combat, you've got a bit of range in terms of bows and crossbows, and also in magic as well, but it's mostly closer up, broadly speaking. Whereas if you move towards Fallout, you've got a mix of the two. You can facilitate playing in melee if you prefer to do that, or you can use range combat if you like as well. It would make some sense for Starfield to lean out in the other direction. I could be completely wrong. However, we have seen a gun, we have not seen any other form of combat equipment, anything in melee at all, so we'll have to wait and see until the summer, but that's my personal hunch on this. Obviously, in that regard, it's not going to resemble Skyrim at all, I don't think. But we may have some technology aspects that could be somewhat mechanically similar to magic in Skyrim, but that's pure speculation, so hell knows, we'll have to wait and see till the summer on that one. So, what about questing? Again, we have another area that we don't know very much about. Bethesda have said almost nothing about the story, other than that we're joining this last group of explorers and with a newest member. But there's a little bit of speculation here that we can get in both high level and some tiny little maybe specifics. That's probably pushing it a bit, but let's see. So, as with all of Bethesda's other games, I suspect we're going to see main quests, side quests, and then sort of miscellaneous found-type quests, I'm going to call it. The sort of thing you stumble across while you're out exploring. Obviously, we get that in Fallout, we get it in Skyrim, and it seems likely that we'll get something along those lines in Starfield as well. So we'll probably have a main quest. If you have a look at the trailer that came out last summer for that, then obviously it doesn't say anything about the quest, but there's little bits of stuff that are stuck up next to the mirror in the main living space of the player's ship that look to be blueprints or maybe copies of pictures of something. So it looks maybe like we're going to be going off and finding some kind of MacGuffin that may have some influence on saving the world. And I'd mentioned saving the world because Todd Howard regularly mentions that as being the concept behind what you can achieve in video games. Whether he's talking about Skyrim, or he's talking about Fallout, or he's talking about Starfield, it's what are you doing in video games? Well, you can go out and save the world, is a thing that he seems to say quite a lot. And if you look at Skyrim and you look at the Fallout games, there's an element of that to varying degrees, but there's an element of that in most of their previous games, and there will likely be something to that effect in Starfield as well. Probably. So for side quests, I suspect that will be somewhat comparable to Skyrim as well, in the sense that when you go to Skyrim, you go from city to city and you find people who need help, you find loads of side quests in and around specific locations, i.e. cities. I think the equivalent, obviously, in Starfield will be planets rather than cities, although there are cities on some of these planets, so maybe a bit of both. So I suspect that's going to be quite familiar. And Bethesda usually like to hide away stories and Easter eggs and little quests and all manner of things like that in their games as well. So obviously, if you look at Skyrim, there are books you can randomly stumble across and read that will start a quest. You can find corpses that are abandoned in the game that might set you off on investigating what happened to them, and all manner of other bits and pieces as well. Likely the same thing will happen in Starfield. It might be crashed spaceships or groups of bodies. We might also find books and the like, and maybe data pads or whatever, that set us off on quest lines as well. So I think we can probably expect to see structural similarities in the questing setup in Starfield to Skyrim, obviously with it being in space. The last thing I want to go over here is levels and perks. So we don't know very much about this so far, but Todd Howard has mentioned that the leveling system, the perk system, is comparable in some way to Skyrim, but he's also said it draws from Fallout as well. And my guess on this is that it'll be a case of multiple skills, you pick specific ones, you put points into them, and they get better as you level up. That's basically what Bethesda do in every game, and a lot of others, so it's not a profound revelation there, I'm sure. But I suspect we will be going into a menu and then specialising our skills a little bit, which will allow you to choose the type of character you want to build. Again, this is what Bethesda like doing, so I think we can reasonably conclude we'll probably see something of that type in Starfield. Which also leads into hints that we've seen recently as well about character customization generally. It does seem that you will be able to customize your character's look, appearance, gender, etc., which you'd probably expect, as per Skyrim or Fallout or any of Bethesda's other games. As to exactly how we're going to go about leveling up, it could go one of two ways, really. We know there's a Fallout influence, so it's possible it's XP from kills, but it's also got a strong Skyrim influence, which could mean you improve your skills by using them. Or there might be some hybrid of the two. So it's really hard to draw a conclusion there, other than to say that in all likelihood, the basic setup of the perks and character upgrades will follow the types of things Bethesda like to do. So if you have a look at the, as I say, that system in Skyrim or in the Fallout games, bits will be familiar. That being said, of course, each time they put out a big mainline new game, like a Skyrim or a Fallout 4, they tend to overhaul the system completely. So we'll still be learning this new system from the ground up, I suspect, when Starfield drops, and it'll be something we haven't really seen before. I think that's probably the vibe that we're going to get from it. So, obviously, they haven't mentioned any of the skills and the like that we might be specialising into yet either. We might start to see some of that in the summer with gameplay trailers, possibly, and maybe gameplay reveals. But, obviously, I think we can assume it's going to be guns over swords, mechanical skills rather than smithing, maybe upgrading your spacesuit. We know there's going to be an oxygen meter, and the player is going to have to keep an eye on their oxygen levels, basically from leaks. So it seems possible that maybe increasing your oxygen tank capacity might be something you'd learn to do through skills. Crafting's a big part of both Skyrim and Fallout, so crafting and upgrading your gear is probably going to be a thing that'll likely be reflected in the skill system, and it'll probably be more technology-based rather than magic. So we can kind of infer that the skills will be built around that. That basically covers the majority of the stuff that I wanted to talk about for how Starfield will be like Skyrim and how it won't. I think in a lot of ways things will be familiar. It's going to have Bethesda's fingerprints all over it, but obviously it's a new IP, it's a new world, it's going sci-fi even more so than Fallout does, so it's going to be new and unfamiliar at the same time. And of course they like to innovate and try and do things new and make each new game feel unique, even if it does sort of exist in the same world of other ones, which Starfield doesn't, but we can still expect to see Bethesda's fingerprints on something unique and new when Starfield drops in November. So hopefully that's given you a few ideas about what maybe to expect. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation in here, and if you're anything like me, there's a good chance you've got some pictures in your head as to what the game might be like. Don't hold too tightly to those would be my suggestion. It's something I know I'm guilty of. But I suspect when Bethesda finally release the game, we're going to see some things we expected, sort of thing that we had in mind, but also some real surprises in there, and Bethesda taking things in a direction we perhaps didn't expect. So, definitely going to be interesting and surprising, and I think it'll have elements that appeal to Fallout fans, I think it'll have elements that appeal to Skyrim fans, and I think it'll do something entirely new at the same time. So, I do hope we've managed to answer the question there for you, or at least giving you a little bit more of an inkling about what might be coming, and giving you an overview of what we know about the game as well so far, which is not huge amounts, but we know a bit. If you would like to check out the sources for most of my theories and things here, I'll link down in the description interviews and the releases Bethesda have given on their YouTube page, and the music as well that I mentioned earlier on as well, so you can check that out too if you would like to. Obviously, there's other stuff as well. There's a Reddit Ask Me Anything that Todd Howard did at the back end of last year that I'll link down there as well, that has some mention of Starfield, but not a vast amount in it. But it's worth a read anyway. It talks about Skyrim and other games that they're working on. There are other sources out there as well, little interviews and snippets that I can't track all of them down. So lots of places that stuff can be drawn from, but hopefully some of the stuff down in the description will give you a little bit more information and something to dive into if you want to explore it more yourself. But for now, I hope that was useful and informative and you enjoyed a little look at some of the information that we do know about Starfield and some of the concept art and stuff that I've thrown up on screen as well. And if you did enjoy the video, please do consider dropping a sub or a like. I very, very much appreciate it. We'll, of course, be covering Starfield going forward up to the game's release and after release as well. Down below the video, along with all the links I've just mentioned, you can find social media links and the merch store and a channel membership button down there as well if you're interested in supporting the channel that way. I very, very much appreciate that. It massively helps out, so huge thanks to everyone who's done that. And of course, we are continuing live stream as well. At the minute, we're playing Fallout 76, we're playing Control, and of course, Starfield will be coming as and when that game goes live. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to speaking to you all very, very soon.